like my ABC.
Games as a genre of historical discourse, the past on fast forward, or at least me talking about what that title from a Digra talk inspires me to. Games can be useful as a way to study history, and there's been several attempts to do so in the past. Perhaps the most famous gamification of history was Oregon Trail, which people played in school in the States, and which remains, in various guises, something that people look at today. Zombie Trail, or whatever it's called, for example. For my part, I remember a horribly depressing World War I simulator on the BBC Micro, which really drove home the point that there was no way to win that conflict, and that no matter what you did, millions of people died. Depressing. Since then, there's been other attempts. There was an educational MMO based on Roman Britain being mooted a few years back, though I'm unsure what happened to it, and Minecraft has been used to map areas of some countries or to recreate the layout of medieval or fictional towns and cities to help people gain a feel and understanding for how such a place was, how it functioned, and what it was like to walk its streets. Such actions can really bring history to life, but they're also an enormous amount of work, and educational institutions often lack the funding to really and truly make use of these tools. So games can be, and have been, used to make history come alive and to help us experience it. But can we have a discourse with history? Discourse implies a conversation, something that's two-way. Well, history is something that has happened a certain way and can no longer be changed, so these two things seem to be in conflict. Creating a discourse with history can undermine the educational value in schools, but could form interesting bases for games. Many games already are based on alternative histories, from the obvious ones like the Nazis won World War II, to the more outre socio-political fantasies found in Bioshock. Interaction with and manipulation of history is less common. Wargamers have for generations refought permutations of famous battles in board games, war games and computer games, and even fought battles that never happened, the Cold War going hot for example, and the real military often plays out hypothetical scenarios as a way of keeping tactics fresh. Even existing fantasy games often draw on the past in terms of arms, armour, social attitudes and so on, something that's heavily criticised but little understood by some elements of game criticism. My view, and that of many writers and designers, is that fantastical elements have to be grounded in an environment of plausibility from which they draw legitimacy in the story. In short, people are willing to accept dragons, provided that the people act like people. It's a sort of societal version of the uncanny valley. We're much more attuned to things that seem out of place in a human context. We'll accept magic when we're introduced to the concept, but a black transgender queen of pseudo-Bavaria is likely to throw off people's immersion. This would also be a risk in creating games that are historical discourse. People freak out at the word nigger in Mark Twain already. Imagine the reaction to a game that recreated life in a pre-Civil War cotton plantation and faithfully recreated the dangers, hopelessness and attitudes of that era. Look at the fuss over those issues in Django Unchained, which was hardly saying this was a good thing and was one big long revenge fantasy. When you create discourse with history, you bring people into the injustices of the past, and they're rightly offended. But they're wrongly offended at the makers of the game rather than the game world itself, the historical or fictional place that's being described. People also want to change it and to fight it, which is good, but creating that in a historical narrative takes away from the point of creating that historical environment in the first place. If you make a game in which part of the point is to make people experience racism, whether it's racism against elves, dwarves or witches, or whether it's racism against black, yellow or brown people, then you start undermining the point. This is something that has frequently been concerning me in regard to historical role-playing games, especially ones relating to the pulp era. These were times of racism, sexism and bigotry far more than today, but in approaching that era in games, there's a tendency in modern game design to whitewash or minimise these aspects of the past in an attempt to appeal to a broader audience. This broad audience, many of which were treated so poorly in the past. Doing so, in my opinion, erases the experiences and hard-fought gains of those communities, and does the modern reader and player a disservice by failing to show us the problems of the past and the reality of the fiction from which we're drawing for our inspiration. History is important, and putting even heroes in a historical context where they might be looked down on for their race, gender, nationality, or any other factor can make a hero more special, more remarkable, more heroic, not less, as well as giving them a chance, in the context of the game, to fight historical injustice from that position of heroism. And I think that makes for a richer experience, and a better game, and ultimately a more satisfying experience for those who indulge in it.